So the last thing we're going to talk about in chapter 7 is conflict management. And conflict happens all the time. It can be very small conflicts, it can be very large conflicts. And so we're going to talk a little bit about conflict management. Now, in our industry, we are extremely fortunate because not only do we get to deal with conflict between our employees and our team members, we also get to deal with conflict between our guests and our team members. So let's first look at what can cause conflict within the organization. I've used the example in the past about the soup spoons at the Sheraton Gunther. So that caused conflict between us and the banquet department because we did not have enough soup spoons. Also, on the bigger picture, we might have competition between departments for funding, budgets, and things like that. If we need to improve, if we are focusing on another area, then another department might feel like it is getting the short end of the stick. So that could cause some conflict. Task interdependence is another way. So that can cause conflict. So if the task involves multiple departments, for example, let's say front office and housekeeping work very closely together. So if housekeeping is doing a great job and keeping the rooms clean, then the front desk can sell those rooms again, get guests checked in. If housekeeping is taking a little bit longer, then the front office can't check the guests into those rooms and the guests are getting upset. So that can cause some conflict. Now, if the front desk is not giving accurate reports to the housekeepers, for example, when a guest checks out, if that's not being updated, then the housekeepers can't do their job quickly and then ultimately can't get that room turned over. One of the things that has really helped and improved that process is a lot of hotels are going to an automated system where as soon as the guest checks out, then the housekeeper is notified on a tablet or a device that they can go in and clean that room. Jurisdictional ambiguity basically just means that there's overlying responsibilities and nobody's quite sure whose job is it to do that specific task. And if it's multiple people's jobs, then the mentality of, oh, well, somebody else will get to it if I can't get to it. And then they might also be thinking the same thing, and then ultimately the task does not get done. And so if there's unclear lines of whose responsibility it is, then the ball gets dropped, and then ultimately production or productivity is going to suffer. Status struggles refers to any kind of employee group that thinks they should be giving the orders, right? So oftentimes, I don't know if you've ever worked in food service, but oftentimes there's kind of like this unspoken hierarchy of the service employees. And so bartenders are typically on the top. And so if bartenders think that they should be giving the orders to the servers and the servers should not be criticizing or giving orders or ways to improve to bartenders, then that could cause some conflict. When really, in reality, they're a team that they're all working together. But if you have that perception that my job is more important than your job, then that could definitely cause some contention and some conflict. Communication barriers. So if we do not, as managers, communicate the goals of our organization in a clear and consistent way, and if our team members aren't aware of those goals, then that can cause contention because if they're not doing their jobs the way we need them to, then that could cause conflict. And so we want to make sure that we are communicating exactly what we need to do. The other communication barrier can also be as far as language barriers. And then the last one is difference in values and beliefs. So sometimes we have conflict just based on different social, ethnic, racial, and cultural beliefs. And so as a manager, it's our responsibility to help our team members realize that we are all on the same team. We are all here for the same purpose. And so what do we need to do as a manager to make sure that we resolve that conflict within our area? Now, when we are choosing to resolve any kind of conflict or manage the conflict that's presented to us, we need to be selective, okay? You've probably heard that phrase, choose your battles. Sometimes if you are over nitpicky and if you kind of focus on the very small, minute conflict, then that could be presented as micromanaging, right? Some conflicts will just eventually resolve themselves. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to completely ignore every single small conflict, but you need to choose your conflicts that you want to get involved with, okay? And if you think that it could potentially resolve itself, great. Well, if it doesn't, you want to still keep an eye on it, because if it doesn't resolve itself, then you might need to inject yourself into the situation, okay? You want to evaluate the participants in the conflict, and you want to see what the source of the conflict is, okay? So again, this is going into the conflict objectively as a manager. We cannot go in with having favorites, having employees that we always think are just not doing a good job. Okay, we want to make sure that we are looking at the conflict objectively, not subjectively. We're looking at what is the cause of the conflict, and that will help us decide how we're going to resolve it. Lastly, we're going to look at the different types of conflict management options and figure out which one ultimately is the best for us to handle. All right, so here's one of those really cool charts. So we have high and low. So right here is our low level, and over here we have our high levels, okay? So now we can identify if we have high levels of cooperativeness and we have a high level of assertiveness, well then we're looking at a collaboration. And that's wonderful, because everybody leaves the situation feeling like they're working together as a team. As far as competitiveness, when something is very important is at stake, maybe it's safety, maybe it's really important for you to come in, be assertive, and less accommodating when we want to resolve that conflict. Now, if you use that approach too much, then people might think that you're disagreeable, that you're not really willing to work with people, and so you kind of get that reputation of being a hard nose. And so we definitely don't want that, but we need to use it when it is appropriate. Okay, compromise here in the middle is important because everybody's giving a little bit. But yet, when you leave the situation and the conflict is resolved, everybody's gotten at least a little piece of what they originally wanted to resolve the conflict, but yet they've all given up something. So in a true compromise, you can't have person A that's given up a little bit and getting a little bit of what they want, and person B that's getting everything that they want. Everybody needs to give a little, but they also all need to leave the situation feeling that they've all gotten a little piece of what they wanted. Okay. When you have low cooperativeness and low assertiveness is when you have avoidance. Okay. Avoidance is good to use in conflict management when you need time to cool off. Okay. And so you want to make sure that you are you're going to come back and address the conflict, but right now is not the moment because your emotions are too high. Lastly, accommodation, okay? So very high cooperativeness, very low assertiveness. With accommodation, sometimes, and we don't want to do this too often because then the guest will start expecting it, but, guests have been trained to just complain. And those people who complain, the people who complain the loudest, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so whoever complains the loudest is going to finally we're going to cave in, we're going to give them a free dessert to shut them up, okay? We don't want to have that accommodation all the time. And we don't want to use that all the time, but there are certain situations where we need to just do it just to diffuse the conflict and to move on. And so we really want to make sure that we're using that accommodation sparingly, and we're using it again when it's appropriate. So for our principle of negotiation, we want to basically separate people from the problem. We want to look at the problem objectively. We want to focus on what people really mean. So again, this uses our communication skills. We're going to be using that informational listening, and then we're also going to use that information that we gathered to then make a decision and evaluate how we're going to handle this negotiation, okay? And how we're going to handle this conflict. So with negotiation, again, this kind of goes back towards that compromise. Some people are going to give a little, most people should be leaving with a little piece of what they actually wanted, okay? So sometimes we need to bring in a third party. We need to remain objective. And so to do this, we want to bring in a variety of different opportunities for third-party interventions. Now think about it this way. If you are the manager and an employee perceives that you have a favorite employee, let's say employee A is your favorite by perception of the other employee B. If you as a manager try to resolve that conflict between these two employees and ultimately you decide that employee A is the one that's right and they keep doing things the way they go, well then employee B thinks that you just selected them just because they're your favorite. And so that's why we need to bring in these third parties. And it might be a boss that's above you. Okay, it might be someone that's higher up in the organization that does not work directly with these individuals, or it might be something that's completely outside of the organization. And so mediation is bringing people together to improve the process, okay, to make sure the work is getting done. And so if departments think that they have an issue that this department's not pulling their weight and this one isn't either, they might feel the same way, kind of going back to our example of housekeeping and front desk. Okay, and so a mediator might come in and they're going to listen to both sides of the story. They're going to listen. They're also going to want to gather some data and look at facts, because oftentimes when there is conflict, people are thinking emotionally and they're not looking at facts. And so a mediator might come in and look at the data of, you know, the time it takes housekeepers to clean the rooms and how many times during the last period we had to turn guests away because a room wasn't ready. We're going to look at that data, and that way they can look at that objectively and present that to the two different groups to say, how can we come together? The process consultation focuses on the attitudes of each other towards them. So we want to make sure that we're bringing people together and we help each other understand the other person's side of the story, okay, the other side of the situation. So often we get hung up and caught up with our responsibilities, and we think that our responsibilities are the most important responsibilities. And if other people aren't doing their jobs, well then guess what? Our responsibilities suffer and we're not able to do that. And so all these things kind of come together to create this conflict. But if as a front office manager, if I actually went into a room with a housekeeper to see what it took to clean a room, then it maybe wouldn't give me, it would give me pause the next time I call housekeeping to say, hey, I need this room done in 15 minutes. Or vice versa, as a server to a cook. If I actually realize what it took for them to remake a steak in the middle of a busy rush because I made a mistake, well then now that's going to cause some empathy for that other person. The cook, if they actually understand what it means to be triple sat, and now you've got to deal with 12 guests all at once and try to, you know, sometimes your mind gets all mixed up as a server. So understanding, that's what that process consultation is to kind of help with the attitudes of the individuals. The last one is organizational changes. So sometimes we might need to make an organizational change on that chart. We might need to move someone to a different department. We might need to move a manager to a different department within the organization to help resolve that conflict. And so these are all different strategies that we can do. And sometimes it takes a third party to come in and look at our organizational structure and say, you know what, this process, this conflict can be eliminated if you restructured a little bit, and they'll give you those recommendations. Ultimately, it's up to you as a manager or a supervisor to implement those recommendations. So why is it helpful for a manager to know his or her favorite conflict management style? All right, it can help anticipate how the manager will behave within that conflict. And so also identifying different ways and when it's appropriate to use different management conflict styles is also important. A guest complains loudly that his orange juice was not fresh squeezed. You know that the orange juice was fresh squeezed that morning, but you agree to deduct the price from his bill anyway. What conflict management strategy are you using? You are using accommodation. We're just going to get them to resolve the conflict so they can shut up and stop being loud in our dining room, right? So sometimes that happens. A study conducted at Cornell University of turnover among hospitality employees found that most employees leave their jobs because they cannot work with their manager or coworkers. All right, a hotel's front desk agent depends on housekeeping staff to give them accurate, timely reports of the status of the guest rooms. The potential for organizational conflict in this situation is called task interdependence. They are relying on each other. 3 out of 5 of your sales teams do not get along. You introduce cubicles, the office to manage, to give more privacy and allow them to work without bumping into one another. This third-party strategy you used was organizational change. Okay, so we changed something within the organization of the company. Which of the following is one of the keys to principled negotiation? All right, all of these are parts of the principled negotiation. Mediation focuses on the issues. Process consultation focuses on what? D, the attitudes that conflicting parties hold toward one another. Great job.